Hey everybody. You know, I had somebody over at, well, let's call him E3000. He messaged me on the YT with several things he put on his Devonon account. And he basically asked me, he wanted to know my opinion on the difference between the writers when it came to Sally's character. And I guess he wants my opinion on the pro Archie Sonic fans against the anti-Archie Sonic fans. And well, first of all, let me start with Sally. You see, Sally being written by Ian Flynn. Ian, I'll give him credit. He's done a great job with Sally. He has. He's basically, let me put it this way. He's retained a little bit of what made her who she is. He's done that. But he's also added a few different elements into her, which is good. But you see, still has the other writers. Now there are some writers that came before him that have put their own unique spin on Sally's character and personality. Some have been positive, some have been negative. 134, written by Carl Bowlers, is a good example in the eyes of many fans. It was a very negative moment. It shouldn't have been done. It was totally out of character for her. But you see, just like with any comic book though, or any kind of media, when somebody takes over, sometimes they take over, but they take over with a catch. And that catch is that they can write certain characters the way they see them. And sometimes, whether it's a good decision or not, in their minds they believe that the fans will understand why they're doing this. Especially if they come out and say this is why they did it. So with like 134, when Carl Bowlers did what he did with Sally, he basically looks at what he did with Sally as how he interprets how Sally would have reacted. Now I'm sure Ezekiel and some others will say that, well, if Ian would probably come out and say, well, if Ian Flynn was writing that issue, Sally would have been more understanding. We can't say that. We can't say whether or not she would have been more understanding, because you got to realize you're working off a story at that time written by Penders and Carl Bowlers and other people, which was around, I think, 125 or something like that, and going up to that section, which was 134. You got to realize you're working off something of tragedy. So you can't say whether or not she would have been the same way. If someone like Ian Flynn would have, well, not the same way, but if whether or not Ian Flynn would have wrote her differently. You can't say that. You have to look at it like, okay, Ian Flynn has to work with what was given. So easily, you could probably say Ian Flynn wouldn't have done what Carl Bowlers did, but he probably would have done something similar. And who's to say that wouldn't have gotten criticism either? Hold on for a second. Like I said, folks, it doesn't matter exactly who would have wrote it. Now, yes, Carl Bowlers shouldn't have done what he did, but again, you can't say that, you can't think that maybe Ian Flynn would have done a better job, because Ian Flynn would have had to work with what he had. And the same could be said for Ken Penders. Ken Penders basically would have worked with what he had. You can't say one person's better than the other. You got to look at it from the standpoint of like, okay, how would they have handled it? Would they have had to do something similar if different? See, that's how you have to look at it. You can't just assume somebody would have been doing something different, just because of who they are. You can't assume that. You know what I'm saying? You can't assume something and say that's how, and believe this person is doing a better job and would have done better if they would have taken over, which probably would not have been the case. And when you look at, let's say, Mike Gallagher or or even Ken Penders, or maybe even Tracy Yardley, you can't say that they would have done differently. You gotta, again, and I know I sound like a broken record here, but you gotta think and maybe assume that perhaps they would have done something similar. You can't assume that they would have done something different, because you don't know that. You know, it's even in other comic books, like DC and Marvel. Sometimes the characters, all depending on who's writing them, get wrote a different way. So you can't say, oh, well, if so-and-so was writing it like he's writing it now, he would have done it differently. No, you can't say that. So we can't say whether or not, you know, Ian Flynn would have done it differently. Just like we can't say whether or not now, if Carl Bowles was still in charge, what he would have done. We can't say that. I mean, again, true, we may not agree with the way he portrayed Sally from 134 and beyond, but the truth being, that's how he interpreted her. We can't say that's how Ian would, we can't say Ian would have done something different or something similar, because you got to work with what came before. And by working with what came before, you got to basically continuing on a story, continuing on the continuity. You know, the same could be said with Mike Gallagher in his stories, in his characterization of Sally. Same with Ken Penders. You can't say that depending on the stories that they had Sally involved in, that if Ian Flynn was involved with them back then, he would have done it differently, because you don't know that. See, Ian Flynn has to work with what is given to him. You know? So you can't say whether or not he would have done it differently or would have done something similar. Now, as far as the pro-Archie Sonic fan base and the anti-Archie Sonic fan base, the pro fan base, you know, they're behind the comic and they're behind Ian mainly because they look at Ian as one of them. As one of them, as a fan that made it, has achieved his goal to write for the comic he loves. They support the comic because they feel the comic is going to go beyond, is going to go and be better beyond their expectations. They basically feel the characters are going to get better developed and the stories are going to be better all the way through. And that is true. And that is true. They have a right to feel that way. The same goes to the anti-group, though. You see, the anti-group, they basically feel that Ian Flynn, and even someone like Ken Penders, all they've done is ruin the comic. They feel they've ruined the comic because they're not staying true to what made the comic what it is. You know, you can just imagine how a lot of them feel right now, basically with what's going on with the 252 preview. And you can pretty much assume that this anti-Sonic fan base, anti-Archie Sonic fan base is cheering the fact that they're probably going to have more supporters on the side because of what's going on. But we can't say that. We cannot say or assume that. But we have to agree that it's their right. It's their God-given right to feel how they feel. And if they want to feel that this is that what Ian and Archie and Sego are doing to the comic is wrong, then who are we to argue with them? It's the same way with the pro group. If they feel what Ian and Archie are doing with Sonic is good, and it's good for the story, it's good for the comic, it's good for the franchise, then who are we to argue with them? You know, it's kind of like with the WWE right now. You know, at SummerSlam and Monday Night Raw, these past 48 plus hours, or past 24 going on 48 plus hours, we may not, there are some of us that may not like the fact that Randy Orton's champion and may not like the way he won it. But guess what? There are those that do like it because they like where the story's going. And they feel it's going to make Daniel Bryan a bigger star than he already is. Even though some of us, like myself, may not like the fact that they're rehashing a storyline that they've done before. But again, it's all right, it's all God-given rights to share and feel the way we do. And that's exactly how both these groups are. The pro group is in support of the comic and Ian Flynn because they feel it's best for what's going on, for the comic's future. And others, they're against it. And the anti-group, they have the right to feel the way they feel, basically by saying, hey, Ian's not right for the comic. Ian needs to go. Or Archie and Sega, they need to get their butts out of the, get their faces out of the butts and start realizing that they need to make the comic the way it should be. It's basically about having a right to opinion. And that is the difference between the two. So, that's my take in response to what TheEzekiel300 asked me. So Ezekiel, there's your response. I hope you enjoyed it. Comment if you like, ladies and gentlemen. I'll talk to you later.